Hello and welcome to another episode of the Construction Corner podcast. I'm Dillon, I'm your host. And today, guys, we are going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, this is for like your solar projects, your EV chargers. There's a bunch of other tax incentives within this bill, but I thought it would be super important to talk about. I actually just learned a bunch about this at the ABC conference that I was at this last week and thought I would share what I learned with you guys this week. And today, as this podcast is coming out, it is Veterans Day. And I want to thank all of you that have served this country, all of you that continue to serve. And it's just super important that we recognize and appreciate all of our veterans for everything that they have done for us and continue to do to protect and save this country. So thank you all for your service and what you do. And just super important to take a moment to recognize the veterans here in America and all that they do for us. Now, moving on to the Inflation Reduction Act. There were a few things that I found pretty kind of exciting or just really some interesting stats that I thought I would share with you guys. First, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and this really is an Inflation Reduction Act piece, but that 89% of the construction industry is non-union. Now, this might vary a little bit, but basically 11 to 13% of the construction industry as a whole, right? That's all trades, everything is actually union. So a very, very small percentage of the construction industry is union labor. We have 500,000 jobs that the construction industry is short. So 500,000 in skilled labor shortage across the construction industry. Now, on an annual basis, the unions graduate, or within an apprentice program, they graduate about 50,000 a year. So it would take 10 years to graduate tradespeople to fill the shortage, right? So we graduate 50,000 a year, 50,000, get added, and we're 500,000 short. And that would just fill it, not to mention any retirements or anything else that would happen over the course of that 10 years. So that's, again, just off the bat, some of the big problems that we're facing. And with that, but here's the thing in the Inflation Reduction Act. Basically, it doesn't allow for any non-union or non-prevailing wage projects. So in that, if a developer goes to create these projects, do any of these projects within the Inflation Reduction Act, again, primarily it's going to be green renewable energy projects, solar, EVs, things like that. They have basically these tax incentives that it goes from, if you just did it normally, you would get like 6% back. And then if you did it with all the things in the prevailing wage, or within the Inflation Reduction Act and all their criteria, which means prevailing wage, using union labor, all that kind of stuff, it goes to a 30% tax credit. So huge piece really in this to incentivize folks to do these projects and then to use them in a basically union capacity so that they get all of these tax credits. So in effect, they weaponize the IRS to use all these tax credits, as well as basically forcing union labor onto these projects so that they're also getting all of these tax credits, even though the majority of the industry is non-union. So in that, you're not using the most of your workforce, you're adding 30% cost at least to the overhead of a project because you have to use prevailing wage within these projects. So you're adding a ton of cost. You're not using the majority of the workforce, and you're forcing all these people into collective bargaining agreements that really they wouldn't want to do otherwise, all because it's government projects. And really, that was kind of one of the things that opened my eyes is when you start to look at government projects, right, this is your schools, your any government stuff. So schools, police stations, fire stations, all this, you're effectively forcing the use of union labor and those collective bargaining agreements, but you're also forcing a 30% increase in the cost of the project, just again in labor costs for this and what, hours they can or can't work and all this other stuff um, through those project types, which then creates a scenario that your property taxes are going to go up because, again, in school projects, they do a bond referendum, which is paid for with the increase of your property taxes. So effectively, the unions have this stranglehold on all these projects, and you're going to pay more for it as a taxpayer. Um, just because they're, even though it's all going to be, US labor, right? Construction, you can't really export that type of stuff. Like those people are going to primarily live and work in the areas that they um, are doing projects. So you're effectively, again, 90%, 88% of all construction workers, you're excluding from bidding on these types of projects because they don't have a collective bargaining agreement. And then the other thing that I found very interesting was um, in order to do these Inflation Reduction Act type projects, you would then have to know what the collective bargaining agreement is. And these are not publicly available documents. Like you got to go call union halls and like call and find these documents. And then hopefully somebody gives them to you so that you know what you're needing to follow for that given area to basically become um, or fall into line and follow all the criteria of the collecting a bargaining agreement, all the things that are in that. Again, since these are not publicly available documents, you've actually got to like call somebody for it, which I thought was very interesting. That again, for these types of projects and public works stuff, that it's not actually going to be publicly available stuff. So again, this all becomes very interesting. And then surveys or how wages get set within union stuff. Again, something that I didn't know that that's how it got set for wages and collective bargaining and all that kind of stuff. So some of these are pretty old because those surveys haven't been done for quite a long time. And so there's going to be probably some updates and some of that if you're going to go after some of these Inflation Reduction Act projects across the country. And then some of these, like, so for solar projects in New York, they set the wage rate for all peoples on those projects based on a journeyman electrician, which is the most expensive versus like a carpenter's wage rate or a pile driver's wage rate or, just a laborer, right? All these different wage rates in there. They just set the highest one for all solar projects, which effectively kill the ability to do any of these projects because the pricing for it, the labor cost is so high that it effectively kills the ability to do these projects and use government funding for a lot of this because, again, they're trying to shove the union down the rest of the industry's throat for boats, right? So the other thing is on the apprentice programs, because again, for these Inflation Reduction Act projects, you have to have 15% of all trades on the project have to be registered with an approved apprenticeship program. So you can divvy up this time amongst, like if say your electricians had more people registered in an apprentice program than your like carpenters, you could, kind of flip that over to where more of your electricians would be on the project versus carpenters to balance it out to where 15% of the overall project is using this a registered apprenticeship program. So within that, you now have to keep track of the not just who's working on your project, when are they working on your project. You now have to keep track of whether they're in a registered apprenticeship program. How often are they on site? What are the all these other tracking and management metrics that you're going to have to add a person for. So you're going to have to add 100 grand and, salaries, benefits, all that other stuff to keep track of these registered apprenticeship programs. And then for the Biden administration, which again we'll see what happens here with Trump and the reversal or what he does within the policies, because again the Inflation Reduction Act was made into law, so now they have to go through some legal review stuff and congressional review with the new body of Congress that gets sworn in here at the beginning of the year to then determine what they're going to remove out or answer. There's a lot of questions too within the Inflation Reduction Act policy and how to utilize and get these tax credits for it. But one thing for an apprenticeship program is that they were doing it on the Biden administration was doing it on a time-based versus competency-based apprenticeship programs. That means you were stuck in the program for 4 years, no matter if you were smarter or better than the next guy, which to me sounds a lot like, communist stuff where you can't test out of it. You can't, move forward because we're trying to, again, create skilled labor. And for a lot of skilled labor, like, some guy works harder or better, they should be able to get their journeyman's card sooner than the guy who's struggling and truly needs those 4 years as an apprentice. And then another thing that was quite interesting that they talked about was in the Gulf Coast and a lot of the industrial projects that they have in just the Gulf Coast with refining and oil and manufacturing and that kind of stuff is they have basically a lot of very skilled and specific tasks that they train people on. I'm sure there's like a specific thing for welding or these specific tasks or installing assembly lines or whatever else they train a ton of people on in these very specific, smaller tasks, right? It's not learning everything to be a journeyman electrician. It's like, hey, we need you to learn these specific skills that we can do in a 1 week course or a few days or whatever, so that they can get these industrial projects that they have along the Gulf Coast done. I thought that was very unique, but it also filled their needs in that area to train folks. And that was just super interesting to me. So this was kind of like the big overview of it is if you're going to go after any Inflation Reduction Act type projects, which are these, again, primarily renewable stuff, is you're going to have to go and find the collective bargaining agreements in the areas that you're looking to work in. You need to have apprentices and registered apprenticeship programs through any state or federal government. You're basically you won't have to join the union, but you're going to have to get, some union labor. And honestly, just as a taxpayer, this was super frustrating to hear that we're going to incur 30% more costs with taxpayer dollars, not really cheapest bid. It's what person can go through the paperwork more often than not to do these types of projects, and that enters into a collective bargaining agreement and joins the union, because that's how Democrats get most of their funding, right? But when you actually look at the votes, usually the union members are like 60-40, 60% Republican typically, 40% Democrat. So even their membership skews towards Republicans, but all the leadership at the top are the ones donating to the Democratic campaigns. So this gets very political very quickly, instead of us trying to deliver projects at the most efficient price, cost, to do these projects. Instead, we're using prevailing wage. And you're going to have to then go through all this other paperwork, add more people to your projects in order to do this, which then becomes a burden on all taxpayers in order to do this project. And you effectively excluded 90% of your workforce in order to, build the school down the street. Like we had a school here in my area that was a $13 million bond, and we were going to raise property taxes. It was like $17 per 100,000, I think is what it ended up being, or something more like that, more or less. Maybe I forget what the actual number. It doesn't matter because it didn't pass. But in that, you're going to raise property taxes. You're going to do it for 30% more. So really, we could have done it for 9.5 million instead of 13, which, again, would have decreased the amount of raise in property taxes we would have had to do these projects, and effectively be able to do something like that. So really incredible how we end up paying more to kowtow to the unions, which again only represent 12% of the workforce in the entire construction industry. So really, really crazy to see. And then here are some other pretty interesting stats that I thought were interesting to share. And in some other episodes, we'll cover this again in like hiring and that kind of stuff. But for every $1 billion in construction spend, you need to add 3,500 people to the workforce. So for every $1 billion, you got to add 3,500 people. And we're projected to add like trillions into the construction industry, which is why we need 500,000 skilled people over the next. I mean, we're short that already, and then it's just going to increase every year. Because also another interesting stat: 1 in 5 people within the construction industry are 55 and older, so they're within that probably 10 years of retirement. So this also creates, in 10 years, you're going to start to, well, even now 1 in 5 are 55 plus. So again, 20% of the industry is nearing retirement age. We're going to have to backfill all of those guys as we move forward. So at the end of the day, we need a lot of people to join the construction industry. And then these requirements that the Inflation Reduction Act is putting onto everybody is problematic. So what we want to be able to do, one, is just bring this to your attention that the Inflation Reduction Act, that's why only like 14 EV chargers have been built, is there's these egregious requirements to do these projects. There's all this paperwork that they have to do that most contractors aren't going to be able to do. There's basically the union requirement and prevailing wage. So we're going to add costs to these projects, which make them cost prohibitive to do, even though you're then going to save 30% on the tax incentives. But because of the increased costs, like it's basically not worth doing anyway. And then with that, we have 500,000 people short. So we need all of these people to come into apprentice programs throughout. And then you've got to have a state or federally recognized apprenticeship program, which every state, and sometimes even jurisdictions have different requirements for what they're going to require to be in their apprenticeship programs. And you can see why people just throw up their hands and say, screw it. Like, why am I even going to try to do any of this stuff? Like, we're just going to keep going after the same private projects that we've been doing. And that's how we're going to be able to move forward instead of having to deal with all this union stuff and paperwork and requirements that are changing and nobody really informs us and are becoming more and more complicated to do on a very regular basis. So within the union stuff, and then again just this prevailing wage, and then trying to do it for these Inflation Reduction Act projects, again EV chargers, solar are the primary ones, but there are others that I think got flipped into this deal. And so with that, of the 5.3 million contractors in the US, 88% need help recruiting and retaining people, right? You're losing people all the time. And so you have that on top of it. So this is what I wanted to cover in the Inflation Reduction Act and everything that it entails. It was really like just so disheartening to hear all of this, as basically I sat through this presentation last week, and there's like a couple other, so there's 220,000 active apprentices. There's 31,216 that complete it. So I mean, it would take 10 12 plus years to get through the government registered apprentice program to actually meet the 500,000 workers that we are short. So that's pretty bad. And then on a whole, like, 10.7% are union on average. Like some states, like I'm looking at a map now. So some states like Mississippi are only 1.3% in the union. Then you have heavy union states like Illinois, Wisconsin, which are 27.6 and 26.6% respectively. California is only 16.8% union. South Dakota's 2%, Colorado's 2%. New Mexico's 3.3, Texas is 1.8. So really, in all of the blue states, you have heavier union presences. And again, with really Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois being right there at like 27% union percentage and union density throughout. But again, still, it is not even close to the majority of it. Actually, so Hawaii's the big one, which is crazy. 38.7% is Hawaii for density of union work, and then like North Carolina has 0.4% union representation, so that's the lowest. So just to kind of give you that, and then yeah, again, 15% of the total labor hours on a project need to come from a government registered apprenticeship program in order to qualify for using any of the Inflation Reduction Act money. And then anybody with 4 or more people on a Inflation Reduction Act project must employ one person within a registered apprenticeship program. Again, you can start to see how this is going to be crazy. And then you're going to have somebody to administer that apprenticeship program for that one person that you're doing to supply to this project. And again, that like we should be training people. We should be having them go through some type of formal training and all that kind of stuff. But to then go through the government rigmarole when it may or may not be the best program to train somebody, and then even if you developed an internal training program, it wouldn't qualify as a government registered apprenticeship program. So then it wouldn't qualify to do any of these projects. And you're basically kind of SOL. So pretty terrible in basically trying to force people into the unions backdoored through this. So you have a piece of law to backdoor people into unions through using the Department of Labor and the IRS to basically force people to do this. So pretty bad. And then that type of thing. And then you have like the Davis-Bacon Department of Labor rules and laws. And the thing that becomes like super egregious through all of this is the penalties. So if you like were trying to follow this and somehow you again, and not somehow, but like you missed something and were basically the wage determination or any of this, like you messed up in some paperwork somewhere, it's $5,000 penalty to Treasury. But if you were willful and intentionally disregarded, which that isn't really actually defined in what intentional is or not, or how you prove any of that, it's 10,000 per worker fine, which becomes super egregious. So nobody is really ever going to do any of this stuff because the fines are just absolutely insane when you're just like trying to do a project and get this executed. So it becomes super egregious in this in doing these projects, and that's basically what I sat through was it becomes so hard to just adhere to these projects to trying to do them the right way where like people are going to throw up their hands with all the paperwork, the costs associated with this. They're not making basically enough money on these projects anyway. I mean, the government or like an average construction company makes $20,000 per employee per year, right? Like that's gross profit on projects like per year. So especially like field level people, right? So you're making 20,000 gross profit per person, and then you're going to have to add all this overhead. It really doesn't become worth it to try to pursue any of these projects. And so it basically turns out to be very bad law, very bad that they put it in. And that's why you're not seeing any of this money doled out, is because the mechanisms behind it to actually utilize any of this money to build, chargers or solar fields. And regardless of what you think about those types of projects, it's that they're just not going to get built because the requirements to do these projects are ridiculous. So that is my take on the Inflation Reduction Act. I could probably go on about this for a while, but those are the highlights. Is if you're going to do Inflation Reduction Act projects, hopefully you're a union contractor already familiar with collective bargaining and prevailing wage work and all the requirements that come along with that. And if you are, you're going to be able to utilize a ton of this money and do really well on those projects. If you're not, good luck in trying to figure out and navigate all of it. But you're going to have to call the union halls and really work through to figure out how to do these types of projects in your local area. So, with that, guys, again, happy Veterans Day. Thank you all for your service. And with that, that is this episode of the Construction Corner podcast. Until next time.